about 7, 8 years ago. And we had a wonderful time then. Since then, I've been working on a number of different issues. I've looked at things like wealth taxes, and I'm going to give myself a quick drink of water. Somebody's on coffee. Things like issues like wealth taxes. We did just done a book on refugees and migration, and it's interesting how those things connect. You might think, well, wealth is on one side of the world and in one conceptual issue, but refugees, migration, asylum, that's kind of somewhere else. You know. But actually, we live in a world that is very deeply, very intensely connected. And I wrote a letter to The Guardian a couple of months ago, or 6 weeks ago, they put in. And I said, look, you've got two stories in the paper which exactly together, if you take them together, exactly show the world that we live in. And one of the stories is about the massive, quick rise in house prices in London. London is now going through another feeding frenzy of house prices, which is spreading through the whole country about. I think it's will lead to another really big housing crash, but nonetheless, that's what's happening. You probably know that in the last budget there was a lot of money put into housing and into helping people with loans. About £130 billion was put into underwrite the housing market. A lot of this has been borrowed by landlords. People are buying multiple properties. So people with money have access to that money. But also another reason for the rise in housing prices is the free movement of capital around the world. But as you probably know, in the last 30 years, since the rise of what we call neoliberalism, the free market, there's been a very unregulated economy. And what has happened is that money flows around the globe at a terrific rate, at a fantastic rate. Money goes to anywhere it can make money. And people with money, and I'm talking about really the top 5% of the world's population, are able to invest that into almost anything that will make more money. Now that, you might say from a point of view of social usefulness, it's best if that money goes into jobs or into building transport infrastructure or broadband or kind of useful, socially useful things. But actually those areas often don't make very much money. They're often not very profitable. So what happens is it goes to wherever it's going to make money. And often that can be simply in buying up all the world's food stocks. So you can see a situation where all of the food in the world, or great portions of it, which has not yet been grown, is purchased in advance in what's called commodities trading. And the very fact of buying all of that increases its price. So the world food last year, the price of food enormously increased in the last year and the year before, to the point where it doubled in some areas. It's very destabilising, but of course it makes huge amounts of money. And if you look at the banks that engage in these kinds of investments, food is one area, property is another, and that explains the rise in the London housing market, because people are moving billions of pounds around the globe, in fact trillions of pounds around the globe, to speculate in whatever is the next thing that is going to go up in price. And of course it's a self-fulfilling prophecy. You buy all of the houses in the centre of London, they're all going to go up in price. And indeed they do. And last month, houses in London went up on average by 10%. Well, that's over 100% a year. So where else can you get 100% return on your capital? So of course, trillions of pounds move. And a single bank, and banks, investment banks specialise in this, and they specialise in moving the money and investing the money of very, very wealthy people. And a single bank in New York, just one, called I'll just give you as an example, you can look it up on the webpage. New York Mellon Bank, it's not the one that you keep your piggy bank savings in. Right? The New York Mellon Bank specialises in investment for very wealthy people. And the New York Mellon Bank says on its website that that's what it does, it invests, and gets big returns. And the amount of money it is now in charge of investing, it's one bank, is $26 trillion. Right? One bank, $26 million. Now the entire American national debt is only 16 trillion. So the amount of money in that bank would pay off the whole American national debt and the European, sort out the European one, and still have change. Just one bank. So what you have is this massive movement of money by very, very wealthy people. And that explains the London housing market. So what happens is that money moves. In this unregulated, uncontrolled system, if you have money, you simply move it to where it's going to make more money. Then people who have access to money, who already have large amounts of capital, can borrow more. So if you have capital, you go to a bank and say, well, I've got $1 million, I want you to lend me another couple of million, and I'm going to buy houses with it. So people with money can borrow more money and have access to more funds. And of course that process of people borrowing, investing, and then in fact lending it to people at high rates of interest who then couldn't pay it back, that process led to the financial crash that we've just had. But the point is, this money flows around in a very uncontrolled fashion. But the free movement of money, of capital, also brings with it the free movement of labour. It has to. What happens is that some parts of the world are intensely developed. London becomes a centre of enormous amounts of investment. It goes into property, then it spills out into other areas, into restaurants, into car buying, into whatever else is happening. So the areas where the money pours into become intensely developed. So you have uneven development. But then, people from other countries that are not as well developed, where the money is actually draining from, because a lot of the money going into London is coming from Spain, from Portugal, from Italy, from other countries, people start to move. And of course, the poorer countries in Europe, Eastern Europe, people move from there as well. So a free movement of capital is always followed by the movement of labour. People have to move, they've got no choice. Poor people move. And often the way in which the investment and manufacturing and industrial investment procedures of the West are conducted, the way in which those are organised, forces that movement. So one of the things we did in the refugee book, and the migrant, looking at migration, was to show how this free movement of capital, this free movement of investment, so whatever will make money gets a lot of investment, that then forces the migration. There's a wonderful film which you might have seen called The End of the Line, which is about fishing. And in one of the scenes in it, the filmmakers go to Africa. They're talking about the destruction of world fish stocks. So they go to Africa and they talk to African villages on the coast. And this is an area of Africa which used to be very rich, very, very wealthy. And It's certainly comfortable. People there ate well, they had good fishing industry. For hundreds of years, this has been a good part of Africa to live. But then one day, European and Russian, other foreign factory trawlers arrive because there's a lot of money in fish. But these people aren't going out in lines and small nets. They're coming with giant factory ships that hoover the sea floor, that take every living thing off the sea floor. They destroy what they don't want, freeze the rest and sell it in Europe or wherever else. At that point, all the people in this part of Africa become bankrupt. They have no money. Their whole fishing industry is destroyed. And as the people that were interviewing said, we had no choice. What happened was that our young people from this part of Africa, they all had to go to Europe to try and find work because we no longer had work here. And then the man from Africa in the film says, it turned out that you didn't like our young people as much as you liked our fish. So that's the next part of this whole process. That the free movement of labour is forced upon people. Not really free at all, it's a forced migration. And then when people move to the richer countries, they then encounter the existing poor people of the country they moved to. And it does create a strain. There's no doubt if you move millions of people across the globe, where do those people go to? They go to the poorest areas. They go to the areas where there's the most likely to be a shortage of houses, of medical facilities, of schools. And then a politician like Nigel Farage, who you possibly saw on television last night on Question Time, says, the trouble is these migrants are coming. And of course a paper like the Daily Express or the Daily Mail will again jump onto that. They won't say, well, what the trouble is, we've got this free movement of money around the world, which is driving all of these processes. I would say to you, the issue of migration is complex. It's not as simple as just saying we should let everybody move around, because actually that kind of forced migration is intensely damaging. Not only creates problems where the people go, it creates massive problems for where they come from. Because you're stripping all the skilled work and skilled workers who you've not paid for, you haven't paid for their education, their training. The rich countries strip the poor countries of those workers. When Nelson Mandela came to Glasgow to visit, the first thing he said was, stop stealing all our doctors and nurses. So it's not as simple as saying, all migration is wonderful. The process that I've described is very, very damaging, often to the countries where people come from. But what is at its heart is this unregulated economic system, where people are simply investing to make money wherever they possibly can. And to do it in ways which are often very damaging to the societies in which this is taking place. But that isn't explained in the media. That's the last thing that anyone would talk about. You read the Daily Express, the Daily Mail, they're not discussing the deregulated nature of capital. What they discuss is this migrant's got a council house, or this asylum seeker is a criminal, or something like that. So the papers then pounce on the potential fears and anxieties of the population, of which there are many, because another effect of the deregulated capital that we have nowadays, the free market system, creates insecurity. We are seeing the destruction of the welfare state, the destruction of education fees, the rundown of the NHS, the rundown of education, the creation of unemployment on a very large scale, with 6.5 million people looking for jobs, either looking for work or looking for full-time work. You see people with working in jobs in which they are abused, treated appallingly, where there are no unions anymore. There is enormous amounts of insecurity. We're in a society which is mass producing insecurity and fear. And migrants, asylum seekers, become an easy target in that society. And the right-wing papers, especially the Mail, the Express, and the Murdoch press, will seize upon that insecurity as a way of selling papers, as a way of pointing the finger at whoever is the latest scary target. Doesn't have to be migrants. It can be migrants. It can be mentally ill axe murderers. It can be gypsies coming to steal your children. Any number of targets, scapegoats will do. Did you watch that appalling story where a child is taken from a family in Ireland because the family's got a dark skin and the child's got a light skin? What society are we living in? Where it's enough to have your child taken away because she looks a bit white and you look a bit dark. And I wrote to the Daily Mirror, of all papers which used to defend the poor and the weak and the oppressed and the excluded. The Daily Mirror had on its front page another blonde child found with gypsy family. That's its headline. And on the inside pages of that particular edition of the paper, they had another story, which was 50% of a person's DNA is shared with a banana. And I wrote to the Daily Mirror and said, I see that you have indicated that 50% of a person's DNA is shared with a banana. Is this the person who wrote your front page? And this is one of the letters that I wrote to papers was destined not to get published. But I said, what happened to the Daily Mirror? You should be ashamed of yourself putting this rubbish on the page. And of course, the child turned out to be the child of the parents. How can you put people through agony and anguish like that on the grounds that their skin's a bit white and they're with a dark couple? What are they thinking of? So, what we did was to try in this book to link all of those processes. Those processes of the movement of capital, the movement of wealth, what it does to a world economy, what it does to our own society, and then how the tensions and anxieties that are generated in that kind of world then create the possibility of scapegoating, of pointing the finger as if it is the fault of the people who are subject to those processes. The people who are suffering most, the migrants, the refugees, people who are fleeing because of the consequences of those. And I haven't mentioned war yet, but when you think that astonishing story where a minister is on television and he says to an Iraqi refugee, you should go back to your country. And all of the papers saying, yes, it's about time somebody said the truth. This person should go back to their country. And nobody in all of that debate says, well, actually, his country is completely trash. And that's got something to do with the fact that we engaged in an illegal occupation, which so far killed at least, or produced the death and dreadful death of at least 200,000 people on utterly specious grounds that they were supposed to have weapons of mass destruction which never existed. Did you see the program, The War You Don't See, but George Orwell? Extraordinary program to look at. You can get it on the internet. But on that program, there was an interview with a man from the Foreign Office who is interviewed by John Pilger. And this man was responsible for defending British policy on Iraq. This is 3 years before the invasion of Iraq. Okay? There's a sanctions policy in place which is killing large numbers of children in Iraq because they can't get medicines, they can't get test tubes into the country. Large numbers of children are dying, and this man has to go to the United Nations to defend Britain's policy. He's interviewed much later on by John Pilger. And Pilger says to him on the programme, The War You Don't See, he says, you know, well, what happened before you went to the United Nations to defend the policy of sanctions 3 years before we invaded? And he said, well, you know, I went round Whitehall and I had to make I had to get the evidence together, so I went round and I interviewed, you know, I saw the people who were responsible, the key people, so I could get the evidence of why, you know, Saddam had these terrible weapons, and so I could present it at the United Nations. He said, but then he said, you know, people looked at me a bit embarrassed, you know, and said, well, actually, we don't think he's got any weapons. There's just a few questions about how he disposed of them. You know, that's all. It's 3 years before the invasion. Watch it. You know, this man speaking. It's an astonishing. This is Britain's represented in the United Nations. With my honours students, I asked, in Glasgow, I asked a very senior person from the MOD to come and speak. He was a person who was in charge of all of the propaganda and public relations during the Iraq War and Afghanistan. And he spoke to the students, and the obvious question was, people said to him, well, when did you know that there weren't any weapons of mass destruction? And he said, well, when they finally came back, you know, with the final report, about 4 or 5 years after we'd invaded, and then it made it clear that there was nothing there at all. And the students obviously said to him, well, what did you feel what was going through your head when, you know, because you'd had years of justifying this war and selling it and promoting it. And there was this silence, you know, and the man just said, well, I just felt deeply ashamed. And it's incredible thing to say. But then, you know, it all goes into the memory hole of history. It all just disappears. And then 40 or 5 years later, you can have a minister saying, you Iraqi refugee, so-called, why don't you go back to your own country? And everyone goes, oh yes, good idea, you know. But nobody saying, we destroyed their country. That's where the refugees came from. Why do you think people are fleeing the world? Who's the biggest, the second biggest arms exporter in the world? It's the UK. You know, the links between all of these things are never discussed. And what you get is the singling out of individual people. You know, this asylum seeker's got a council house. This one's a criminal. And then when you check the stories, again and again they turn out to be wrong anyway. But I spoke to journalists about this, and I asked them, I put people in the Daily Star and a number of other papers. I can't even tell you the name of the papers because the journalists were so nervous about speaking, they wanted anonymity, complete anonymity. I couldn't even say the papers. I could say, well, it was a tabloid, it was a broadsheet. But one actually didn't mind so much from the Daily Star. And here's what he said about, I asked him about the editorial values of the Daily Star and what it was like when he worked there. And he said this. You know, he said, there's nothing better than a Muslim asylum seeker. He said, in particular, that's a sort of jackpot if you get one of those. He said, you know, it's very much the cartoon baddie, the caricature, you know. All social ills can be traced back to immigrants and asylum seekers flooding into this country. And of course, it's a wonderful political strategy. It's a commercial strategy for the papers. They can exploit people's fear. They can use this pointing of fingers. Also, it's a great political strategy. You just stop the asylum seekers, it's all okay. Stop the migrants, it's all okay. And another journalist from a broadsheet, I won't say from Murdoch, very, very big broadsheet. And he describes what it's like and how difficult it is to resist this. And he said, in a way, he said, the sad thing is the journalists don't have to be instructed or told. He said, in a newsroom, it's not a democracy, he said, it's an autocracy. People are very scared, they're very frightened. They're frightened for their jobs, they're very nervous, they're insecure. The youngest journalists have the least amount of power, and they'll do anything that they're told. And this is what he said to me. Invariably, it's the younger reporters who are sent out to do these sorts of monstering jobs. That's what he says. So what's what they call it? To monster somebody. To literally turn somebody into a monster. To do these kind of monstering jobs. Because they want to get on. The newsroom's an authoritarian place. A more experienced reporter could refuse. One editor had a terrible reputation for bullying. But the imbalance between news editor and young, inexperienced reporter is enough to get that person, the reporter, to put their conscience aside and to go and monster an asylum seeker. And that sums up that working relationship. And then, of course, what happens is when the papers are full of these things, these terrible stories and this rubbish that pours out day after day in the headlines and tabloids, what you then find is that people can simply repeat these headlines, that people can, without any effort at all, you take a random sample of people in the public, you just say, you don't even need to tell them what it's about before they arrive. I do focus groups, we don't tell people what they're about, we give them no clue. They walk into a room, you sit down, give them a cup of tea, and you say, right, we're going to talk about migration or asylum or whatever. And people immediately pour out these headlines. And you say to them, here's a bit of paper, write down headlines about migration and asylum refugees. And they can, without any effort at all, because what's happened is that this language, this way of seeing, this way of believing, has become part of our everyday culture. It's in the back of people's heads. So what you get is this whole stream, and I'll read you some through focus groups. This is what people wrote. 300,000 refugees in Britain, 200,000 missing. Refugees taking over. Crime rate increases in populated area. Asylum. More protests against volume of asylum seekers. Britain is being invaded. Free homes for asylum seekers. Refugees overflow. Flood of refugees from European countries. Government putting more stringent laws. Asylum seekers are taking our benefits. Britain getting flooded by refugees. I'm familiar with you. It goes on and on and on like that. Because that language of the press becomes, and the TV, I have to say, becomes our immediate language. Even Channel 4, even things like Jon Snow on Channel 4, can sit there showing the book, questioning a Home Office minister, asking how many premises he's raided to look for migrants, illegal migrants, as they call it. On that same Channel 4 programme, a couple of days later, there was another item on Channel 4 News, making a big story about 5 cleaners who did not have the right documents, who were working in the Home Office. And it was the Home Office that found them, just on a routine check of their documents. It was no big deal. But it was run as an enormous story on Channel 4 News. not on what it meant to these people to be arrested, what it meant to their families, what it meant for them to be forced home with no money, what it did to their lives. Oh, none of that. That's old Channel 4 news. New Channel 4 news is about the sensation of finding illegal migrants in our midst. And the journalist doing this actually uses the phrase to summarise the story. I'll read it to you. The very people they were supposed to kick out of the country had been hired to clean their desks. Channel 4, liberal, minority, tell the truth news is now using phrases like migrants kick out of the country. The other day, I watched a Channel 4 news programme after it was published, and they did a whole thing on how many Romani were coming to Britain. Another mad thing on numbers, you know. Huge numbers of Romani coming to Britain. We reveal. You know. And they were giving the figure of 200,000. Britain, hundreds of thousands of Romani coming to Britain. 200,000. And they kept going on and on about this number. And I always listen to numbers and remember there's 65 million people in Britain. So 200,000 is just under 1/3 of 1%. And yet this is, you know, we've now been overwhelmed with Romans. Many of you are actually already here anyway. So it's an extraordinary situation where the news journalists get so wrapped up in that culture. And on that programme was a woman from UKIP, who I have to say was about 5 miles to the left of Channel 4 News. I mean, the woman from UKIP, you know, they kept going to her and saying, what do you think about all these Romans coming? And she would say, well, you know, they're European citizens and they've got the right to move around, and I mean, as long as they're here, they've got to be integrated. And I was thinking, oh my God, she sounds, you know, and she was quite a lot to the left of Channel 4 News. So you have to ask, what is going on and what are the consequences of this for our society, for the people who live here? Because we have generations of migrants in this country now, people who've grown up, been born here, and it's intensely fearful experience to have your communities where you live raided by big vans saying migrant immigration police and restaurants turned over. And I mean, you don't experience it here, but in Glasgow, for example, there are big areas which are migrant areas. And these vans patrol around, migration police, and they arrive and will turn over whole restaurants, shut places. You know, and the existing migrants who are born in this country, you know, feel their whole communities are under threat and under attack by these policies. And the media are egging on the politicians to do more. Meanwhile, the politicians want to get votes, so they are encouraging the media to do more coverage. So you get this extraordinary symbiotic relationship between the media and the governments. The governments want to show that they're doing something, so they stick the vans out with big signs saying migrants go home or whatever, you'll be arrested, and then they film those and use them for their own publicity. The Home Office, you know that awful programme, UK, what's it called, Border Agency, UK, it's a dreadful programme on Sky. UK Border Force, I think. That was actually paid, the Home Office paid Sky £400,000 towards doing that. You know, it basically features people having their doors kicked in. But the government was paying it because they wanted publicity about how awful they were being to migrants, basically. And then, I tell you later, because people complained about bias and inaccuracy and what it meant, they had to give them, Sky had to give the money back. But obviously it's symbolic of what is happening in that relationship between the media and the politicians. And while I'm still on this piece about refugees and migration, I'll just read you a couple of comments from people who talked about their own businesses. These are people who live in Glasgow, who are British citizens, who've got businesses there, but who themselves feel massively under threat by this climate that's been created. So here's somebody saying, I've been raided my shops about 5 times when I've been working in my own shops. And the way they treat you, it's the worst bit. It's like you are the criminal. And another one saying, this is a woman who owned a bakery in Glasgow. She's a British citizen. 6 or 7 months ago, the police were coming in vans and running out into the shops. And people were hiding in bathrooms, and they were rounding them up and putting them in vans. That was scary, because how can you tell which one of us is an asylum seeker, which one's genuine? And she said to her, though she was a British citizen, though she had shops, she had a very ordinary British person. She carried a passport with her now all the time because she's got dark skin and she's afraid of being rounded up in this way. And another man spoke about being stopped, about having his van stopped and being called out in the middle of the night by the police. And then he was questioned. He said, there's nothing wrong with my van, there's nothing wrong with the drivers or anything. But they called me out essentially because we're Asian. And they doubted it. And they thought. And he says this, the question that annoyed me the most was when he said, where are you from? And I said, well, could you clarify that, please? And he said, where were you born? And I said to the policeman, Ealing in London. And then he said, no, but where are you from? And I said, I'm from London. He goes, no, what's your ethnic background? And I said, well, I'm British or I'm Scottish, he said. But I knew where he was coming from. So you create a society which is full of fear, which mass produces fear, anxiety, meanness. A process where people are organised into poverty, exclusion, and then the most poor, the most excluded, the most threatened are then pointed at as if they are the danger, as if they are the cause. And this is all being done in the name of what? Of defending the banks, of keeping rich people rich, or stopping the most obvious thing that needs to be done, which is that you need to redistribute wealth. It's perfectly straightforward what you need to do. You need to stop the free flow of capital in that way. You need to stop this intense concentration of wealth, which is actually damaging the world and damaging the development of our own society, and you need to redistribute. And that needs to be done through a strong state, and it needs to be done through wealth taxes. We said 3 years ago, when the crisis broke, it's absolutely obvious if you've got a single bank with $26 trillion in it, that is going to be destabilising. It's not just that one bank, but all of them. If you have an economic system based on those principles, it must destabilise not just your own country, but the whole world. And I don't know if you saw this, but amusingly, we put forward this proposal 3 years ago. We did the figures, the calculations for it. We said, look, you can a simple 20% tax on the richest 10% of the population, on their wealth. As we said, in this country, the richest the richest 10%, the top 10% of Britain, have about 4 million pounds. And just a fifth of that would wipe off the whole national debt. So you could forget about the deficit, the debt, everything. You can start to rebuild the country. Just 20% tax, that's all. They can keep the other 80%, but just a 20% wealth tax would wipe out the whole national debt. We put that forward 3 years ago, and we made a program. Some of you might have seen it. Have you seen that program? I'm going to show it to you again. Which is an interesting one to look at, because it's treated as such derision. It's like, one of the reasons I did it was because I wanted to see how the media would respond to it. I was teaching an honours class, and I was quite interested to see. I thought, well, I'll write this as a story, as a potential way of solving the economic crisis, perfectly rational, obvious way of doing it, and I want to see how the media respond. And what happens is that the central media, the main BBC News, the Today programme, all those people, many of whom I know, I gave them the figures, I gave them all the stuff. I commissioned an opinion poll from YouGov, a national opinion poll, and 74% of the population in this poll said they thought it was a fantastic idea and wanted it. I gave the poll results to the television. But what happens is that the main central authoritative TV, the main news programmes, the Today programme, all of those, all the core of the BBC United, they won't touch it because it's not, they can't talk about things that are outside what is acceptable. But the knockabout funny programmes on the periphery, like the Jeremy Vine show or Daily Politics, or whatever, they will take it. So I went on the Jeremy Vine show, and he puts me on with kind of somebody, very extreme person from the City of London, who's shouting at me, "You want to make Britain like North Korea," or whatever. They kind of turn the whole thing into a soap opera. And then I went on to the Daily Politics, the Daily Politics show, some of you've seen it, with Andrew Neil, and I was on with Grant Shapps, who is now the chairman of the Conservative Party, and Yvette Cooper. And they can't think of anything against it at all, except to kind of beg me with their eyes to say, look, you can't take money off rich people. Basically the only argument against it. But I'll show you that this. What's interesting is how, when I did the programme, they gave me 3 minutes to lay out the case, and then they discuss it. But it's an interesting case because you can see how right from the beginning, the interviewer says, well, these things are all very nice, you seem very nice, but isn't this really cloud cuckoo land? You might be completely potted. And the programme is called Soapbox. It's exactly, you can see how it's all put. Because the irony is that 2 days ago, the Guardian reported that on a big study by the IMF, saying the IMF, the International Monetary Fund, saying that what was required is a wealth tax of 10% on the wealth of the richest people, and that will immediately push the world back into pre-crisis levels of debt to GDP ratio. So the IMF took up exactly the same idea, the same everything, 3 years later. But I still think the rich are going to say no. But we will see. I'm talking about restructuring the whole economy with these wonderful hundreds of millions of trillions. He said, well, they bought sofas. I'm serious. And you can see him running back to Lytton Crosby and saying, for God's sake, give me a better line, than they bought sofas. The line that they come up with, well, it turns out not to be about sofas, it's about scoundrels, it's about migrants, it's about welfare people, it's about disability people, it's about, and of course they then after that launch this enormous campaign about where the real problems of our society lie, supposedly lie, not with this completely lunatic system which is accumulating giant amounts of money and property for no purpose at all. And the cause of the problem, is, instead of being that, is about migration. And when you think that they then launch and spend enormous amounts of money chasing, terrorising, scaring people. Where I stay in Glasgow, just north of Glasgow, near to there, there's a little village, I think it's called Balmore. I remember reading the local paper that the border agency had raided the Indian restaurant in this village. And it had shut, and they had arrested 7 people. And I thought, as migrants, we've done not the right documents, whatever. And I was thinking, what on earth was the point of that? What was the point? What does it cost to mount a huge raid like that? Perhaps 200,000, 300,000 pounds. Then you've got all the processing of the people that you send to the back, and so you're talking about probably £1 million of taxpayers' money. And what have they achieved? They've shut a restaurant. It is not the case that 7 unemployed young people from Dumbarton are now going to set up an Indian restaurant. They just aren't. They can't cook, they don't know how to run a restaurant, they can't do Indian food, and they don't live in Balmoral. It's not going to happen. They spent £1 million of taxpayers' money shutting an Indian restaurant. Well done. What was the point? And yet, that is then presented as a triumph of migration policy. And of course, the budget responsibility, as the office responsibility, the Office of Budget Responsibility, then comes out saying Britain actually needs 10 million more migrants because the migrants are so much more productive to the economy than indigenous workers. One reason for this is you don't pay for the skills and the training. You get that free, as I've already said. And then you get the youngest, brightest, best of the migrants. So none of this makes any sense in terms of economic policy, in terms of national policy, in terms of stability, in terms of growth. None of it makes any sense. It makes sense only in terms of keeping rich people very rich, in terms of stabilising the banks, in terms of keeping money in the hands of the powerful. And that has to be changed. We say this is a crazy society. We are manufacturing misery, meanness, a society which reproduces and encourages hatred. And why are we doing that? What is the purpose of it? To keep rich people rich. Because as she said, these are the people who are most skilled at keeping their own money, not making sure nobody else gets it. Well, that has to change. And I won't talk anymore now. I'll just say thank you for having me here. But we have to